My father always told me that concrete never lies. You can pour it under cover of darkness. You can polish the surface until it gleams like imported Italian marble, and you can coat it in sealant to hide hairline imperfections. But if the mix itself is flawed, if the proportions of sand, cement, and water are off by even a fraction, the load-bearing weight of the structure will eventually seek out that hidden weakness. It will crack, and when collapse comes, gravity won't care how many millions you spent decorating the luxury penthouse above it. For 30 years, I lived and breathed by that truth as a combat engineer in the military and later as a master contractor. I spent 3 decades pouring deep foundations across western Pennsylvania, inspecting critical steel welds and verifying seismic calculations until my fingers bled across drafting paper. I believed I had instilled that principle of integrity into my only son. I thought I had built a lasting family legacy, strong enough to withstand any economic storm or betrayal. I was wrong. The most catastrophic cracks don't appear in reinforced concrete or steel. They appear inside the human heart when unchecked arrogance, blind ambition, and greed erode a man's character from within. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below right now, so I know how far this dramatic story has traveled across the globe. This is a gritty narrative inspired by real-life battles of family loyalty, corporate betrayal, and hard-earned justice. I promise you right now, the enduring lessons woven into these words were forged in concrete and paid for with sweat, tears, and absolute truth. If you have ever watched someone turn their back on family for superficial status, hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so we can continue building our global community of integrity together. The atmosphere inside the Grand Plaza Ballroom on that crisp October evening was thick with champagne fumes, imported cologne, and the suffocating scent of corporate self-importance. It was the 25th anniversary celebration of Vance Infrastructure Group, the contracting company I had built from scratch, with nothing more than a rusted metal toolbox and a battered old Ford pickup truck. Over 50 of our top regional developers, civil architects, and lending partners were seated around crystal-laden tables beneath multi-million-dollar chandeliers. Standing proudly at the head table was my 28-year-old son, Julian. He wore a custom-tailored Italian silk suit that cost more than my first commercial work vehicle, his dark hair perfectly coiffed, his face flushed with vintage wine and blind ambition. Sitting beside him was Victoria Sterling, the striking woman who entered his life 5 months ago. She wore a backless emerald evening gown that caught every reflection of the chandelier light, her slender fingers resting possessively on Julian's forearm. Her smile was poised, sharp, and entirely devoid of human warmth. It was the calculated expression of a seasoned hunter watching the steel teeth of a trap close securely around a prize trophy. Julian tapped his silver dessert spoon against his crystal champagne flute, commanding immediate silence across the packed ballroom. The low murmur of industry titans quickly faded as every eye turned toward the podium. I sat quietly 2 seats away from him, my hands resting on the white linen tablecloth, the calluses across my palms scraping slightly against the fabric. I fully expected a traditional toast to our quarter-century of engineering achievements, perhaps an honorable mention of the dedicated laborers who had swung framing hammers in freezing January winds to build the towering skyline right outside our window. Instead, Julian reached into his leather briefcase, picked up a legal document bound in crimson leather, and slid it directly across the table until it stopped against my water goblet. He looked down at me with an artificial superiority that made my stomach turn. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing off the marble pillars for every major partner and competitor to hear clearly. He announced that the modern construction industry no longer had room for analog thinkers. He declared publicly that Vance Infrastructure Group was undergoing immediate executive restructuring to prepare for aggressive global expansion. Then, pointing directly at the crimson document lying before me, he demanded right before 50 of our most important corporate relationships that I immediately sign over 50% of my personal equity and transfer total executive voting control to Victoria, establishing her as our new managing director of strategic development. If I refused, he stated clearly, he would walk out right then, sever our relationship forever. and publicly disown me as his father. A suffocating silence descended upon the banquet hall. Men who had trusted my word on $60 million highway contracts stared at me with shock, pity, and intense curiosity. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her piercing emerald eyes locking directly onto mine. She believed she had orchestrated the ultimate checkmate. She looked across the table at my graying hair, my weathered skin, and the slight limp in my right knee, a physical souvenir from a collapsed trench 40 feet below ground during the brutal winter freeze of '96. She thought I was just an exhausted old man who would quietly swallow his pride and surrender his life's work simply to preserve the fragile illusion of family harmony in front of the city's elite. She thought I would tremble, pick up the gold pen, and hand over my corporate kingdom just to keep my only son from walking out the door. Julian slammed his open palm onto the polished mahogany table, the sound cracking like a gunshot across the silent room. He called my conservative management methods outdated. He claimed my insistence on thorough structural inspections and zero-depth ratios was suffocating his grand vision. He conveniently forgot who had crawled through freezing mud to lay the concrete drain pipes beneath the very building we were standing in. He forgot that the original blueprint of our 15-story headquarters had been drawn by flashlight on the dented hood of my truck while freezing snow accumulated on my shoulders. I looked into my son's eyes, searching desperately for any trace of the boy I had raised, the kid who used to wear my yellow hard hat and carry a plastic toy hammer around my job sites. But that innocent boy was gone, replaced by an arrogant stranger, intoxicated by the poisonous whispers of the woman beside him. This public betrayal cut deeper than any injury I had ever sustained on a dangerous construction site. Broken ribs and shattered fingers eventually heal with physical therapy, but seeing your own flesh and blood weaponize 25 years of parental sacrifice to impress a manipulator felt like a cold steel blade twisting between my shoulder blades. I did not reach for the pen, I did not raise my voice, and I did not utter a single word of defense or anger. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up from my banquet chair. I reached across my chest and calmly fastened the middle button of my charcoal suit jacket. I looked right past my son and locked eyes with Victoria for 3 long, agonizing seconds. For the briefest instant, her veneer of supreme confidence cracked, and a distinct flicker of genuine unease flickered behind her expensive mascara. I turned my back on the podium, stepped away from the head table, and walked calmly toward the heavy oak exit doors. The rhythmic strike of my leather dress shoes against the polished marble floor echoed with freezing precision through the silent ballroom. I pushed the heavy doors open and walked out into the October night. The sharp autumn wind hit my face like shards of ice, but the void inside my chest felt infinitely colder. As I climbed into the cab of my work truck and started the engine, I knew with absolute clarity that I could no longer protect my son from the bitter consequences of his choices. He had chosen to build his house on quicksand, and my only remaining duty as a master builder was to step aside and allow the law of gravity to teach him what 25 years of fatherhood had failed to convey. I drove through the silent streets of the warehouse district until the dashboard clock of my pickup truck flicked to 4 in the morning. I pulled into the gravel lot behind our old equipment depot and unlocked the door to my private drafting office. The air inside smelled of familiar cedar shavings, aged vellum blueprints, and the faint, comforting aroma of heavy machine oil. I didn't reach for the light switch. The pale glow of the street lamps outside filtered through the tall warehouse windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor and drafting tables. I lowered myself into the worn leather chair behind my desk, wincing slightly as the dull ache in my knee joint throbbed in rhythm with the dropping outside temperature. Changing weather always served as a reliable biological clock, reminding me of the thousands of hours I had spent standing on damp earth and freezing scaffolding. Julian had completely forgotten that the luxury downtown apartment he slept in and the imported German sports car he drove were financed entirely by my calloused hands and 18-hour workdays. He looked at our 15-story headquarters downtown and assumed it had risen from the earth by magic. He looked at the $40 million in bonded surety assets and assumed they had always existed as neat digital numbers on a bank screen. He didn't know the choking stench of burning welding rods on an August afternoon, or the bone-numbing frostbite of pouring rapid-set concrete at 2 in the morning before a winter blizzard shut down the interstate highways. He didn't know that every dollar in our corporate surplus account represented an hour of sleep I had sacrificed, or a weekend I had spent double-checking load stress diagrams so no commercial building bearing our family name would ever suffer a catastrophic failure. I ran my fingers across the scarred oak surface of my desk. Near the left corner, a deep groove was still visible where a heavy steel framing square had slipped from my grip 20 years ago. The painful memory rushed back with a force that made it difficult to breathe. Back then I owned almost nothing except that old pickup truck, a box of rusted wrenches, and my personal honor. My greatest and only true asset in this world was my late wife, Clara. She was the remarkable woman who sat on overturned drywall buckets beside me in unheated trailers, sharing cold sandwiches while we reviewed subcontractor bids by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. She was the one who stayed awake with me until dawn, brewing bitter black coffee while I recalculated complex structural retention walls. Clara always told me, with that quiet strength in her eyes, that as long as our foundation was built on honesty and hard work, no storm on earth could ever tear our roof down. When Julian was born, I held his tiny form in my calloused hands and swore a solemn oath to the universe. I swore I would build an impregnable fortress around him. I swore I would work myself to the bone, so he would never have to know the biting hunger or the desperate uncertainty that Clara and I had endured. I poured every ounce of my energy into Vance's infrastructure to create a launchpad for his dreams. But 5 years ago, aggressive cancer took Clara from me in 3 short months. The fortress I had built still stood tall against the city skyline, yet the moral compass inside it had rotted away into dust. The little boy I had carried across muddy trenches was now handing his mother's life's work over to a woman he barely knew, willing to discard his own father like a broken tool just to buy her superficial approval. The burning grief in my chest gradually solidified into something far denser and infinitely colder. A seasoned master builder does not weep uncontrollably when he discovers a fatal structural defect. He calmly diagnoses the failure point and prepares for controlled demolition. I unlocked the bottom right drawer of my desk and reached beneath a thick stack of archived structural surveys from '98. My fingers found the cold, matte black casing of a secure satellite backup phone, a remnant from my days consulting on sensitive government infrastructure contracts. I powered the device on and punched in a private 12-digit number I had not called in over 6 years. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the third beat. It was Marcus Trent, a former Army intelligence investigator and senior forensic auditor who now ran the most ruthless private reconnaissance agency on the East Coast. We had served together in the Corps of Engineers. He knew that when I called from that line, it wasn't for casual social pleasantries. "Harry," Marcus said quietly over the encrypted connection. "It's been a long time. Tell me what's cracked. I need a complete structural breakdown on a woman who calls herself Victoria Sterling," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "She stepped into my son's life 5 months ago. I need every hidden layer stripped away immediately. I need to know her origin, her true financial liabilities, her past corporate affiliations, and exactly what kind of poison she has poured into Julian's ear to turn him against his own blood. Give me her date of birth, and whatever initial background checks Julian ran when he brought her on board," Marcus replied, the sound of keyboard clicking audible through the earpiece. "That's precisely the problem, Marcus," I said coldly. Julian didn't run a check. He looked at her smile and handed her the keys to our corporate vault. "Dig deep. Check regional bankruptcy filings, civil court dockets, and offshore credit syndicates. I want the absolute truth on my desk before noon tomorrow. You'll have every blueprint by midday, Harry," Marcus promised before the line went dead. At 11:45 that morning, Marcus Trent arrived at my industrial yard in a black-tinted SUV, walking into my drafting office with a thick manila folder of verified forensic intelligence. His expression was grim as he placed the heavy documents on my drafting paper. "You called it right, Harry," Marcus said, pulling up a stool beside my table. "Victoria Sterling is a synthetic identity crafted 4 years ago in Delaware. Her real birth name is Victoria Thorne, from Baltimore, and her professional history isn't corporate synergy. It's high-stakes asset liquidation and predatory marriage. I opened the folder and scanned the spreadsheets, court dockets, and wiretaps. What stared back wasn't the profile of a business executive. It was the chilling anatomy of a financial black widow. Look at tab 3, Marcus pointed out. Over 12 years, Victoria has been legally married 3 times to mid-sized contractors in Ohio, Maryland, and New Jersey. Notice the pattern? Within 8 months of each marriage, every single one of those firms suffered sudden liquidity crises. She convinces husbands to restructure ownership, takes 50% equity, secures massive commercial loans from shadow lenders, and funnels the cash directly into offshore shell accounts as consulting fees. By the time banks trigger default clauses, she files for divorce, claims personal bankruptcy on legal technicalities, and leaves the husbands holding the bag while their businesses get dismantled by creditors. And what brought her to Pittsburgh? Why target Julian? I asked, checking a red flag report highlighting 3 private collection agencies. Because she ran out of runway, Marcus said grimly. Tab 4 shows her liabilities. Victoria owes $450,000 in syndicated gambling debts to underground betting operations in Atlantic City and Macau. Her creditors aren't patient bankers. They are syndicate enforcers who have frozen her personal bank accounts and threatened severe consequences if she doesn't drop $500,000 in clean collateral right away. She desperately needs your company's $40 million clean balance sheet and bonding line as a sacrificial shield to wipe out her debts before those enforcers break her legs. I closed the manila folder slowly, the heavy paper thudding against the oak desk. A wave of profound disgust swept through me, quickly replaced by an absolute icy clarity. My foolish, arrogant son believed he had conquered the corporate world and won the heart of a brilliant strategist. He had no idea he had opened our front doors to a desperate, cornered predator who was planning to butcher our 25 years of labor on the sacrificial altar of her gambling debts. Do you want me to hand this dossier to Julian? Marcus asked quietly. Or do you want me to forward these files to the Federal Fraud Division and let the authorities pick her up at your headquarters downtown? No, I replied firmly, locking my gaze onto Marcus. If we show this to Julian right now, his pride won't let him believe it. He'll claim we forged the documents to smear the woman he loves. He'll take her side, hire aggressive litigation attorneys, and tie the company up in court while she bleeds our accounts dry from the inside. And if we call the feds right now, the scandal of an executive fraud investigation will destroy our municipal bonding reputation overnight. Then what's the play, Master Builder? Marcus asked, leaning back against his stool. We give them exactly what they asked for, I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. We let them take the throne, but before we hand over the keys to the castle, we remove the structural foundation and let them experience exactly what happens when you build a skyscraper on hollow ground. As soon as Marcus departed, I initiated the first phase of my counteroffensive. I drove to a quiet diner behind the freight rail yards to meet 2 of my oldest industry allies, Frank Miller, whose ironworks supplied 90% of regional commercial rebar, and Elena Rostova, owner of the state's largest concrete network. Both had stood shoulder to shoulder with me 30 years ago during bitter winter freezes when our word was our bond. Frank slammed his coffee mug down, his face thunderous with rage. Harry, he growled, half the city is talking about what happened at the Grand Plaza. I had general contractors calling about Julian pushing you out for that fancy girl. Tell me if I need to drive downtown and teach that kid some respect. Elena placed her hand over mine, her eyes blazing with loyalty. It's an outrage, Harrison. You and Clara sacrificed everything for that company. Say the word, and I'll cut off every concrete delivery to his sites by noon. I raised my hand gently. I didn't call you here for hot-headed retaliation, my friends. I called because I need you to help lay the groundwork for a controlled structural demolition. I slid 2 newly stamped legal packets across the table between our cups. They bore the embossed seal of my independent firm, Vanguard Structural Engineering LLC, which I earlier upon noticing Victoria digging through our accounts. I need both of you to execute these master vendor agreements immediately, I instructed. Transfer every preferred material tier, priority delivery schedule, and specialized credit line exclusively to Vanguard. Furthermore, formally terminate all 30-day open credit extended to Vance Infrastructure effective today. If Julian Vance or Victoria Sterling order a single cubic yard of concrete or one steel I-beam, they pay cash on delivery. Zero credit, zero grace periods. Frank chuckled heartily as he signed. Julian thinks because he sits in the corner office, he owns the dam. He doesn't realize our industry extends credit to the man whose signature is on the check, not the corporate logo. Without your guarantee, Vance Infrastructure is just paper. Precisely, I nodded as Elena signed alongside him. Let's see how fast their corporate synergy operates when they must purchase materials with actual cash. On Thursday morning, Corporate Counsel Harold Finch notified me that the master equity transfer ceremony would take place at 2 o'clock in the executive boardroom. I dressed in my navy blue suit, polished my work boots until they gleamed, and drove downtown to hand them their kingdom. Julian sat proudly at the head of the conference table in my old leather chair, looking every inch the conqueror alongside Victoria, who wore an immaculate white suit and gold jewelry. Her eyes blazed with predatory hunger as she stared at the stack of stock certificates before them. Harold Finch cleared his throat nervously and slid the master agreement across the glass table. "Mr. Vance," Harold said softly, "this document formally transfers 50% of Vance Infrastructure Group's voting equity and total operational authority to Ms. Victoria Sterling, establishing her as managing director and co-signatory on all executive accounts. Upon your signature, you transition to a non-voting emeritus role." I picked up my gold pen, looked directly into Victoria's triumphant green eyes, and signed my legal name on the first 2 pages. Before reaching the execution page, however, I paused, laid the pen down, and calmly turned back to page 14. I tapped my index finger firmly against a single-spaced legal clause near the margin. "Before we finalize this transfer, Victoria," I said. My voice, as her calculating mind, weighed the risk against her immediate need for our balance sheet to satisfy her gambling debt. Blinding herself to the trap beneath her feet, she forced a dazzling smile, picked up her pen, and signed her full legal name right beneath the liability covenant with a flourish, sealing the transfer on the final page. "Signed, sealed, and executed," Victoria declared triumphantly. "Vance Infrastructure Group is under new management, Harrison. Enjoy your retirement." I secured my copy in my briefcase, stood up, and looked down at them with a quiet smile. "Congratulations to both of you," I said clearly. "I sincerely hope this new leadership structure provides exactly the education you both deserve." I turned and walked out of the boardroom while they uncorked champagne, completely unaware that my structural trap had just snapped shut around their necks with 10,000 tons of force. If you have stayed with me up to this turning point in our story, take 3 seconds right now to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment with the number 4 right now, so I know you are still standing shoulder to shoulder with me, and tell me exactly how you think this trap will crush our arrogant gold digger. Exactly 72 hours later, on Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, the illusion of corporate synergy collided violently with reality. Across town at our flagship $60 million riverfront complex, the supply chain froze solid in minutes. 12 transit mixers from Elena Rostova's ready-mix fleet never arrived at the gates, while 10 tractor trailers carrying 40 tons of fabricated steel I-beams from Frank Miller's ironworks bypassed the site and returned to their depots. Panicking, Julian called Frank directly, only to be informed with freezing contempt that under Section 8 of their covenants, open credit terms were null and void without Harrison Vance's personal guarantee. Julian needed to wire $480,000 in certified cash before 11 o'clock. When Julian called Elena, she delivered the exact same cash ultimatum. Before Julian could process those demands, couriers from our primary lenders arrived bearing emergency demand letters. Lenders and surety underwriters had spent Friday reviewing formal legal notices, withdrawing my personal chief engineer stamp and proprietary seismic retention patents from the riverfront project. Without my license seal certifying compliance, the Municipal Building Commission issued an immediate mandatory stop work order across all 4 active Vance sites citywide. The commercial banks triggered their adverse material change default clauses, revoking revolving credit, and demanding $48 million in accelerated loans within 5 days. At 11:40 a.m., two stone-faced syndicate collection enforcers entered the 14th floor lobby, demanding Victoria's $450,000 gambling debt, filing prejudgment liens against her newly acquired 50% corporate equity, and freezing her personal bank accounts under Section 14B. At 2:30 that afternoon, my satellite phone rang with Julian's mobile number. I let it ring 5 times before answering. "Dad, everything is falling apart." Julian gasped in panic. "The banks revoked our $48 million credit lines. Frank and Elena cut off our steel and concrete shipments. The city slapped us with mandatory stop work orders, and 2 terrifying syndicate enforcers are sitting in our lobby demanding $500,000 from Victoria. Please call your bank contacts and fix this." I listened in unyielding silence before replying coldly. "You declared that my methods were outdated and demanded executive control on Tuesday night. You are the CEO now. Handle your own structural failures." I hung up, grabbed my briefcase, and drove downtown. 20 minutes later, I walked into our executive boardroom, where Julian sat slumped in his chair while Victoria stood pale against the glass wall. Julian rushed over, begging, "Dad, thank God you're here. We made a mistake. We need $20 million in cash collateral by Friday morning, or the surety underwriters will seize every building we own." Victoria stumbled forward, forcing a sickly smile. "Harrison, this is just a miscommunication. We are family. If you just put your engineering stamp back on the riverfront blueprints, we can face these bank creditors together." I locked eyes with her in freezing contempt and fanned out my certified legal documents across the table. The first file confirms that every proprietary seismic retention system and deep excavation framing patent utilized across our sites is registered exclusively under my name and my new firm, Vanguard Structural Engineering, I said clearly. "And under Section 14B, the clause you signed with such pride on Thursday. You personally own 100% joint and several liability for $60 million in accelerated corporate debt, plus your gambling arrears." Victoria gasped in horror and collapsed into her chair as she realized the contract she signed had transformed into a titanium bear trap, locking her into tens of millions in personal debt from which no bankruptcy court could ever extract her. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Victoria's corner office on the 14th floor was entirely vacant. During the dead of night, while Julian paced his apartment in nervous collapse, Victoria accessed our emergency contingency safe, cleaned out our remaining $14,800 in petty cash, and fled Pennsylvania under cover of darkness to escape her syndicate enforcers, leaving behind a formally signed petition for annulment on Julian's desk. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Julian stumbled into my drafting office at Vanguard Structural Engineering, looking broken, dirty, and exhausted from weeping. He dropped heavily onto his knees on the cold concrete floor right beside my drafting table. "Dad, I am so sorry," Julian choked out, weeping bitterly. "She took everything in the safe and left me to drown. I was so arrogant and blind. I betrayed you and destroyed everything you and Mom built. Please help me save what little honor is left in our name." I looked down at my weeping son, my heart aching with profound grief. But 30 years of engineering taught me that if you prop up a leaning wall with artificial supports instead of fixing the footing, you guarantee a catastrophic collapse later. If I handed him a $40 million Vanguard corporate check without accountability, he would never grow into a man of integrity. By clearing into unshakable determination, he picked up the pen and signed without a single word of complaint. True to his promise, Julian reported to the riverfront excavation site at 4:45 a.m. wearing steel-toed boots. For 6 months through freezing autumn rains and blinding winter snowstorms, I watched him transform as he hauled 40-pound rebar bundles, mixed mortar by hand until his knuckles bled, and took orders from veteran foremen with absolute respect. Today, watching Julian skillfully guide a 10-ton steel framing beam into place on the 12th-floor scaffolding of our newest bridge project alongside his union brothers, I see a humble master craftsman who has finally learned that true wealth is forged in accountability and earned through honest sweat. Remember this: when you build your life on bedrock, no manipulator, No gold digger and no economic storm will ever be able to bring you down.